The Kingdom of the Twisted Hat. In a very, very distant corner of the universe, far beyond the brightest stars and candy clouds, there was a peculiar kingdom called Smilia. This place was famous for one very special reason. All of its inhabitants wore extravagant hats, each one more ridiculous and colorful than the last. But the most eccentric hat of all belonged to the king of the realm, King Twister XIII, whose hat was so big and heavy that he always walked with a tilt. Hence his nickname, the King of the Twisted Hat. In the heart of Smilia lived a young man named Norman, who, although just a humble hatmaker's apprentice, was convinced he was the best hat creator in the world. Norman had such overconfidence in his abilities that every hat he made, no matter how crooked or poorly crafted, he considered a masterpiece. One day, Norman decided it was time to show the world his magnificent hats. He headed to King Twister XIII's castle, dragging a huge cart full of his most spectacular creations. The hats came in every shape and color imaginable. Some had peaks like mountains, others were decorated with bells that rang with each step, and one even blew soap bubbles at random. When Norman arrived at the castle, he was greeted by Queen Rosalind, known for her elegance and impeccable taste in fashion. "Ah, young Norman," exclaimed the Queen with a smile, "I've heard of your, striking hats. I'm very curious to see your masterpieces." Norman, chest puffed with pride, began to present his hats to the Queen one by one. However, as he showed each one, the Queen's expression grew more and more confused. Finally, she couldn't hold it in any longer and burst out laughing. "These hats are the most ridiculous I've ever seen," she exclaimed between laughs. "But they're so absurdly funny that they might cheer up our dear king, who has been very sad lately." Norman, thinking the Queen's laughter was admiration, felt even more confident. "Of course, Your Majesty," he replied, "my hats are unmatched in originality and style." Queen Rosalind led Norman and his hats to the grand throne room, where King Twister XIII sat with a bored expression on his face. When the king saw Norman's hats, his eyes widened, and a smile began to spread across his face. "These hats are incredible," said the king, unable to hold back a laugh. "I've never seen anything so absurdly wonderful." "Your Majesty," said Norman with an exaggerated bow, "I present to you the flying elephant hat." The hat was a cardboard monstrosity, with giant ears that moved and a trunk that made a trumpet sound whenever someone walked by. The king put it on immediately and ran through the castle, trumpeting through the hat's trunk and making everyone he passed laugh. "This is fantastic, Norman," the king shouted. "You've brought joy to my kingdom." Norman, convinced this was a sign of his unparalleled talent, decided he needed to create something even bigger. So, he announced that he would make the ultimate hat, a hat that would outshine all others. For weeks, Norman worked tirelessly in his workshop, surrounded by piles of fabric, feathers, sequins, and other exotic materials. Finally, he emerged with his creation, a hat so large it had its own internal weather system. There were clouds that shot out bursts of confetti, a rainbow that changed colors, and a small spinning sun on top. Norman took his hat to the castle to present it to the king and the entire court. When the king put on the hat, a confetti lightning bolt lit up the hall, and everyone applauded. "This is the best hat of all," shouted the king. "You're a genius, Norman." Norman, swelling with pride, began to bow repeatedly, unaware that the hat was becoming heavier. Suddenly, the small sun on top of the hat started spinning faster, and the hat began to wobble. "Careful, Norman," shouted Queen Rosalind, but it was too late. The hat fell off the king's head and, like an avalanche of sparks and confetti, rolled across the hall. The king, laughing hysterically, said, This is the funniest thing that's happened to me in years." But then, a storm cloud from inside the hat began to shoot confetti sparks more intensely, causing a small fire to break out in the throne room's curtains. Panic ensued. Guards ran in all directions, trying to put out the fire with their own hats, which didn't help much, as most were made of flammable materials. In a desperate attempt to fix the chaos he'd caused, Norman tried using another one of his hats, the Hat of Saving Rain, to put out the flames. But instead of water, the hat released a torrent of tiny colorful fish that slid across the floor, causing the guards to trip and fall. The chaos was complete. The throne room filled with smoke, confetti, fish, and hysterical laughter. King Twister XIII, still amused by the situation, couldn't stop laughing, but his laughter mixed with coughing from the smoke. Finally, the fire was extinguished, but the throne room was left in a mess. Burned curtains, slippery floors full of fish, and an air of confusion reigned in the place. Norman, covered in soot and holding a fish in his hand, realized he had made a big mistake. The king, with tears of laughter in his eyes and still coughing, said, "Norman, your hats are certainly unique, but perhaps you should learn a little more about how to make them less dangerous." Norman, finally understanding that his overconfidence had led to disaster, nodded with his head hanging low. "I'm so sorry, Your Majesty. I promise I will improve." And so, Norman learned a valuable lesson about the importance of humility and the need to constantly learn and improve. And although his hats remained extravagant and ridiculous, he made sure they never again caused such chaos in Smilia. And the kingdom of Smilia, with its inhabitants wearing extravagant hats, remained a place of joy and laughter, though always with a watchful eye on Norman's inventions.